different than my morning series of true crime facts of the day. Anyway, on April 6, 1895, poet and playwright Oscar Wilde was arrested for being gay. Oscar Wilde here had a male lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, son of the Marquess of Queensberry. La-di-da! The Marquess took a criminal libel case against him, in which Oscar Wilde lost, and he would be arrested in a hotel in Knightsbridge because back then, homosexuality was against the law. He would end up spending about 2 years in prison. Wilde would die on November 30th, 1900, of meningitis. Hello, true crimers. Let's do a new series. Hey, howdy, hip-hop. Police initially said he was a suspect simply because he wasn't emotional enough. Hello, true crimers. This is the case of Barbara Gibbons. Viewer discretion is advised. This case happened in Litchfield County, Connecticut, and it was back in 1973. Barbara Gibbons was a 51-year-old mother. At the time of this case, she was living in the house with her 18-year-old son, Peter. It was September 28th, 1973. 18-year-old Peter had come home from being at church, and he got home sometime just before 10 p.m. When he walked inside their home, he found his mom brutally murdered. Apparently, Peter would make 5 phone calls to different people asking for help, and his friend Jeffrey, I guess, came to the house, and then police were called. Behavior that is probably a little suspicious, sure. When police arrived at the scene, Barbara, they noted, had been stabbed just many, many times. The coroner would also determine that she was likely sexually assaulted. Her son Peter, to them, did not seem emotional enough. He seems to be devoid of any emotion, and so that made them consider him a suspect immediately. The thing is you don't know how you're going to react to something like this until it happens, and everybody will react differently. There is no perfect cookie-cutter way you are supposed to react. At any rate, Peter was brought in for questioning. He volunteered to take a polygraph test, which he passed. He talked to the police without a lawyer because he said that would make him look innocent. Always get a lawyer, folks. They subjected him to 24 straight hours of interrogation when he finally confessed to killing his mom. Very quickly afterwards, though, he would recant his confession. He said he was coerced into this. He was browbeaten until he said the thing they wanted to hear. They had no physical evidence, nothing, to connect him to the murder. But at any rate, he goes on trial, and because of his own confession, he's convicted, and he's sentenced to 6 to 16 years in prison for manslaughter. In 1974, renowned playwright Arthur Miller became a huge supporter of Peter, and basically offered to pay legal fees to get his appeal done. He was granted an appeal. They discovered that the original prosecutor, who has now died of a heart attack, he had files that they discovered where he withheld evidence and witness testimony. Damaging evidence that suggested that Peter had no way of being able to do this. Because Peter Riley, that was his last name, he had been seen driving his prized possession, his car, by multiple people, very reliable people, all during the time when Barbara would have been murdered. Prosecution said, we're not going to tell that to people. We're not going to call those witnesses or let the defense know. And then another look at the case determined that he in fact was coerced, and they based their suspicions simply off of him not being emotional enough. In 1977, his conviction was overturned. A person's emotional reactions is not evidence that you can really say is evidence that a person committed murder. But police just felt that he did it, and so they just made it seem that way. And just, even after his conviction was overturned, police would basically continue to slander his name, stating that they still believe he was the guilty party, even with evidence, now having evidence that he could not have done it. I don't know if there was DNA left behind, and that's how he determined she was sexually assaulted, so I'm not sure about that particular route. But they haven't announced any other suspects. In 1978, he ends up suing the police department for $2 million because they continued to say he was guilty. That case would later be dismissed. And then we're back to square one. Barbara Gibbons, a 51-year-old mother, was found stabbed to death and sexually assaulted in her home. Her son was very likely falsely accused, and the proper investigation was completely just thrown to the side. they didn't investigate anyone else other than Peter, which now means that that person, whoever actually killed her, has had decades to just trash any evidence, to get as far away as possible, to never be caught. And that is not fair to Barbara. She deserves justice. She hasn't gotten it yet. But somebody somewhere out there may know the truth. This was in the 70s, and at this point in 2024, her killer is very likely dead, or perhaps maybe in their 70s to 80s. And if they're still out there, they deserve to be caught and spend whatever little time they have left in prison. If you have information about the murder of Barbara Gibbons, please contact the authorities at 860-626-1820. Police an innocent sleepover would turn into a brutal homicide, but did they really catch the killer? Hello, true crimeers. This is the case of Rita Polite. Viewer discretion is advised. It was December 5th, 1998 at approximately 6:30 a.m. A 911 call would come in that a house was on fire. When firefighters arrived, they noticed that the fire is contained really just to a bedroom, which is here in the back of the house. And specifically here where this burn mark was left, there was a person on fire. There was blood caked onto a nearby wall and just dripping down. When the fire was put out, the victim was pronounced deceased. The victim was 40-year-old Rita Polite. At the time of this story, 40-year-old Rita Polite was the mother to 3 children. Her 2 daughters had moved out of the house and they were in college, and her son, Michael, was still living there. Now, her and her husband, Ed, had recently gone through a divorce, and the proceedings weren't exactly great. This is an older photo of the family. At the time of the story, Michael Polite is 14 years old. He was the one to discover his mother on fire in her bedroom, something that will be scarred into his memory until his end of days. But not only did he have to experience seeing it, within 2 days of the murder taking place, he was arrested and charged with that murder. This is his mugshot. And what were they basing their arrest on? Well, first and foremost, they said Michael wasn't reacting emotionally, that he wasn't acting the way they expected him to react. Now, I'm not a psychology expert, but I do know that every single person on this planet can have a very different reaction to the exact same thing. And the idea that a person needs to have this cookie-cutter style reaction to something horrific is asinine to me. The other evidence that police had came from this young man, Josh Sansuzi, who was there that night because he was having a sleepover at Michael's house. They were friends. Well, in this interrogation footage, he is with his parents. Well, first of all, congratulations for actually following that procedure. Don't see that often. He stated that at one point in the night, he heard a sound that caused him to wake up. He said he looked up and he did not see Michael in his bed. And so police ran with that and basically said, great, that means he got out of his bed to kill his mom. So the other evidence they had, they took some samples of the carpet, a control sample, to test for accelerants. They also pulled samples from where the actual body was found on the carpet. They claimed there was an accelerant, that there was gasoline. Michael, pictured here with his mom, was wearing a pair of sneakers, and they tested his sneakers, and they said they found traces of gasoline on the ends of his sneakers. They also said they have witness statements to say that Michael and his mom didn't exactly always have the greatest relationship. As a matter of fact, not too soon prior to this, Michael had said some comment to his mom of, you're going to be 6 feet under soon, just like, your parents. They took that as him threatening to kill her. But for the most part, Michael actually really loved his mom. They had a pretty decent relationship overall. It sounded like they had your just typical, not perfect relationship between teenage boy and mom. And Rita was a great mom, and she loved Michael as well. But police said they had enough, and so they arrested him and charged him with Rita's murder. Based on virtually no actual physical evidence, no murder weapon was found. She was bludgeoned over her head several times. That ultimately was her cause of death, not the fire. But no weapon was found. There was not a single itty-bitty drop of blood anywhere on Michael or his mysterious killer. It really was not a lot of evidence they had against this kid. But they were sure about it, and they really just didn't bother investigating anyone else. And so the defense didn't present anyone else as like other potential killers. And Michael Polite found guilty of killing his mom. and he would be sentenced to life in prison. Michael, pictured here in the middle, was not ever going to give up, though, claiming that he was innocent. Eventually, like the Innocence Project and other places kind of took up his case, and they found some pretty incredible evidence, primarily with the gasoline evidence. Some new scientists would work on this, and they discovered that there really wasn't actually any signs of gasoline on the carpet, that the initial investigator just based that finding on a visual appearance. The gasoline on Michael's shoe, turns out, wasn't gasoline at all. Years down the road, even the crime lab who helped basically convict him would even go on record saying, yeah, that wasn't gasoline on his shoes, you were wrong. It was a chemical used in the adhesive of his shoes, which was a common thing back then, but also was not well known back then. And so they mistook it for gasoline. But then years down the road, they said, nope. They also would talk to his friend Josh many, many years later, and he said his statements, all those years ago was under duress because they had been talking to him for hours and hours and hours. And he said what he meant is that when he woke up, he looked over and he just didn't see Michael in bed. He didn't say Michael wasn't in bed, just that when he looked up, he couldn't see him. But he basically now says that I'm pretty sure Michael was in the room the entire night, but no one ever brought him to the stand. There was also a shoe impression found just outside the house that absolutely would not have belonged to either of those two boys or Rita. They never investigated who it belonged to. Which brings us to Ed, the now ex-husband. You see, during the divorce proceedings, he would stand up at one point and scream, "You won't live to see a dime of that money," when it came time for alimony and all that. He was very bitter. The thing is he claims to have an alibi. However, police did not dig into his alibi back then. Not to mention, one of Ed's cousins, a man named Johnny Polite, was seen in town the very morning within like half an hour to an hour of the murder happening. Multiple witnesses placed him there. By the way, I think I forgot to mention where the story happened. It was in Hopewell, Missouri. So in 2022, a Hopewell, Missouri court would end up releasing Michael, not because of all the evidence, just on parole. But his conviction still stood. Even though the prosecutor then said, I want to have this conviction overturned. We don't think he did. We think they did a bad investigation, and that this was all just bad, and that Michael is innocent. But then that DA lost his, run for office, and then nothing has happened since. He's still, technically, a convicted felon. He has gone out and said he believes his father is responsible for his mother's murder. That if he truly was at his alibi, that he hired Johnny to do the deed for him. It was an adult-sized shoe impression just outside the house. Well, now it's too late to even investigate that. That shoe is long gone, and there never was any physical evidence to actually point to Michael, or his friend in the house, by the way. And also, there was domestic issues with him to her. Then he says in court, you're not going to live to see a dime of the alimony money? Then she dies like a week later? Why on earth would they not actually think it was him, instead going with the 14-year-old son? So Michael is released, but he's still considered a killer. But hopefully they'll do the right thing in Missouri and get her the justice she truly deserves. An innocent sleep of Thanksgiving Day, a briefcase, and an explosion would all lead to a wrongful conviction. Hello, true crimers. This is the Thanksgiving case of the Blount family bombing. Viewer discretion is advised. This particular story takes place near Lake Worth, Texas. The Blount family lived in the Hilltop Mobile Home Park near Lake Worth, Texas, and on Thanksgiving Day, they had everyone over for dinner. It was November 28th, 1985. The family that was there that day included the dad, Joe Blount, his daughter, Angela Blount, and Angela's cousin, Mike Columbus. And there were several other people there as well. They had a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. It was over by about 5 p.m., and then the family decided to go their separate ways. At approximately 9 p.m., Joe's wife, Susan, decides to lay down and just rest for a bit, while Joe, he would drive Angela, Mike, and another relative named Robert to a nearby convenience store. They were going to get some ice cream and some drinks and stuff. While everyone is out, Susan, when she's laying down, hears a knock at the door. She goes to the front, she looks out the window, but doesn't see anyone, so she goes back to rest in her bed. When the others get home, when they walk up to the door, they see that there is a briefcase just resting on their doorstep. They thought, oh, maybe someone, dropped off an early Christmas present now that Thanksgiving is over. Or they didn't really know what it was. But they just assumed that someone from the family left it there, so they brought it inside. Once inside, they placed it onto the countertop, and then Angela flipped the latches, opened it, and then an explosion. Joe, Angela, and Mike were killed instantly. Another relative, Robert, who was there back in the house, was seriously injured. His shoes apparently were caught on fire and melted to his feet. But this is the damage it did. This is the actual trailer. This is how severe that bombing was. So when police arrive, they're trying to look for any type of clues, any evidence that they can. When they're kind of questioning the neighbors, a neighbor across the street from them tells police that, well, he had been involved, the neighbor had been involved in illegal weapon sales. He told police he thought maybe he was the intended victim of this briefcase bomb, and that maybe someone dropped it off on the wrong doorstep. But police couldn't find any evidence to corroborate that, and they couldn't find any evidence really at all. There was no physical evidence to actually connect this to anyone. And so the case went cold for about 10 years. That's when a man named Michael Tony came into the picture. Michael had been in jail at that time, 10 years later, for an unrelated burglary charge. Well, another inmate would come forward to say that Michael had confessed to the bombing. So police would then go to Michael's wife, Kim, and say, do you know anything about this, about his involvement in this? She says, no, there's no way he did this. She said, Michael, killing people in a bomb, that's insane. But then later she comes back and changes her story. She said she remembers seeing him with a briefcase with bombs in it.
Make me cry.
And that on the day of the bombing, she was in the vehicle with him, and they had gone to a propane store. Michael took the briefcase, and he walked across the street from the propane place where a mobile home park was. When he came back, he no longer had the briefcase. Then another cellmate of his would come forward to say that Michael confessed that he was paid $5,000 for this briefcase bombing, implying that someone hired him to do it. The problem is that particular inmate who told police this information of the day, and there were no witnesses to the crime. No one saw anyone entering or running from the home. They did have a bloody shoe print in the home, and the murder weapon was left behind. Roughly 10 months or so after the murder took place, this man here, Marcellus Williams, was in jail for an unrelated crime, when another inmate named Henry Cole told police that he had confessed to the murder of Felicia Gale. Apparently, they then searched his vehicle that he was driving around the time Felicia was killed, and in the car, they did find some of her belongings, like a piece of her clothing and her husband's laptop. However, the bloody shoe print found at the crime scene was not his size, nor did it match any shoes he owned. Now, Henry Cole, the inmate, he wouldn't testify against Marcellus unless he was paid. Henry Cole was also known widely as a gigantic liar. All of the information that Henry Cole provided was information that was actually in the newspaper about this case. And then, Marcellus's ex-girlfriend also agreed to testify against him, but only until they paid her a lot of money as well. She was also known as a huge liar, and she was facing solicitation charges around the same time, so she was looking for a deal. Her story did not match Henry Cole's story of his confession, nor did it match the crime scene itself. The girlfriend said that he had a bunch of scratches on him shortly after the murder, yet Felicia Gale had no DNA underneath her fingernails. There was no indication she scratched anyone. So based on pretty much those two witnesses and the items that were found in his car, he was convicted of the murder. Not one piece of physical evidence placed him in the house during the murder. No fingerprints, no DNA, nothing. But he was convicted and sentenced to death. Fast forwarding now to 2016. They were allowed to do post-conviction DNA testing on the knife that was used to kill her. There was an ample amount of DNA left behind. And we're talking about that this is the murder weapon. So the person who held it, who repeatedly stabbed her over 40 times, they left a bunch of skin cell DNA on that knife. They tested that DNA in 2016 against Marcellus Williams, 100% not a match. He had absolutely no contribution to any of the DNA on that knife. The knife that would have been wielded by the killer who viciously stabbed her over 40 times. To my knowledge, I would think they tested it against her husband as well, and I'm assuming it didn't match. Plus, I'm sure he had an alibi and all that. So, in 2017, the then governor gave Marcellus Williams a stay of execution. And that was largely due in part to this new DNA evidence, because they are stating in the prosecution's case that he was the one to stab her. But now the DNA is saying, no, it was not him. So the then governor of Missouri puts this panel together in order to conduct interviews, look into this evidence, and kind of further look into the DNA. And then he apparently had some kind of scandal where he stepped away from the governor position. And then a new governor was put in, and then that panel that was put together by the previous governor, well, basically they disbanded. And they gave nothing new to his case. As recently as August of 2023, the now current governor of Missouri has put the execution back on the table. Meaning the stay of execution is done, he is now set to be executed. However, they do not have a date set yet. Even though the DNA evidence of the actual murder weapon does not have his DNA on it at all. The only thing that got him convicted was primarily the two testimonies of two extremely unreliable people who would not testify unless they were given a lot of money. And both of them are considered to be liars. They're known liars. And both of them were also seeking deals in other, arrests that they had gotten. Now, from what I understand, again, the husband's computer and the clothing item was found in his car. I don't know, there isn't much about why that was, like if there was an explanation for it. Apparently he did have a history of, theft, but from what it sounds like, he says, he didn't commit this murder, but I don't know if he's expressed why he had their items. And that is a big concern.